Hi, dear students. Today we are going to learn about the history of psychology. In the beginning, wound, introspection, and the laboratory. Psychology is a relatively new field in the realm of the science. Only about 125 years old. It's not that no one thought about what makes people tick before then. On the contrary, there were philosophers, medical doctors, and physiologists who thought about little else. Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC, wrote about the relationship of the soul to the body in his De Anima as well as other works. Plato, his teacher, felt that the soul could exist separately from the body, a view that has become known as dualism. René Descartes, a 17th century French philosopher and mathematician, agreed with Plato and believed that the pineal gland, a small organ at the base of the brain, was the seat of the soul. Philosophers tried to understand or explain the human mind and its connection to the physical body, while medical doctors and physiologists wondered about the physical connection between the body and the brain. For example, physician and physicist Gustav Fechner is often credited with performing some of the first scientific experiments that would form a basis for experimentation in psychology, with performing some of the first scientific experiments that would form a basic for experimentation in psychology with his studies of perception. And physician Hermann Helmholtz performed groundbreaking experiments in visual and auditory perceptions. What were the basic ideas of structuralism and functionalism, and who were the important people in those early fields? It really all started to come together in a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. It was here that Wilhelm Wundt, a physiologist, attempted to apply scientific principles to study of the human mind. In his laboratory, students from around the world were taught to study the structure of the human mind. Wundt believed that the mind was made up of thoughts, experiences, emotions, and other basic elements. In order to inspect these non-physical elements, structured read someone else's mind. Wundt called this process objective introspection. The process of objectively examining and measuring one's own thoughts and mental activities. Wundt might place an object such as a rock into a student's hand and have that student tell him everything that he was feeling as a result of having the rock in his hand. All the sensations stimulated by the rock. This was really the first attempt to anyone to bring objectivity and measurement to the concept of psychology. This attention to objectivity together with the establishment of first true experimental laboratory in psychology is why Wundt is known as the father of psychology. Tishner and structuralism in America. One of Wundt's students was Edward Tishner, as enlightened, who eventually took Wundt's ideas to Cornell, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Tishner expanded on Wundt's original ideas, calling his new viewpoint structuralism. Because the focus of study was the structure of the mind. He believed that every experience could be broken down into its individual emotions and sensations. Although Tishner agreed with Wundt that consciousness, the state of being awareness or aware of external events, could be broken down into its basic elements. Tishner also believed that the introspection method could be used on thoughts just as it was on physical sensation. For example, Tishner might have asked his students to introspect about things that are blue rather than actually giving them a blue object and asking for reactions to it. Such an exercise might have led to something like the following: what is blue? Where are blue things? Like the sky or a bird's feather. Blue is cool and restful, blue is calm, and so on. In 1894, one of Tishner's students at Cornell University became famous for becoming the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology. Her name was Margaret F. Washburn, and she was Tishner's only graduate student for that year. In 1908, she published a book on animal behavior that was considered an important work in that era of psychology, The Animal Mind, Washburn in 1908. Structuralism was a dominant force in the early days of psychology, but it eventually died out in the early 1900s. As the structuralists were busily fighting among themselves over just with which key elements of experience were the most important, a competing view arose not long after Wundt's laboratory was established. Shortly before structuralism came to America. Then William James and functionalism. Harvard University was the first school in America to offer classes in psychology in the late 1870. These classes were taught by one of Harvard's most illustrious instructor, William James. James began teaching anatomy and physiology, but as his interest in psychology developed, he began teaching psychology at most exclusively. His comprehensive textbook on the subject, Principles of Psychology, is so brilliantly written that copies are still in print. Unlike Wundt and Tishner, James believed that trying to study consciousness was like trying to study the wind. Conscious ideas are constantly flowing in an ever changing stream, and once you start thinking about what you were just thinking about, what you were thinking about is no longer what you were thinking about, it's what you are thinking about. And excuse me, I am a little dizzy. I think you get the picture anyway. Instead, James focused on how the mind allows people to function in the real world, how people work, play, and adapt to their surroundings. A viewpoint he called functionalism, in which physical traits that help an animal adapt to its environment and survive are passed on to its offspring, becoming part of the animal's traits. It physical traits could aid in survival, would could not behavioral traits do the same. Animals and people whose behavior helped them to survive would pass those traits on to their offspring, perhaps by teaching or even by some mechanism of hereditary. It is interesting to note that one of James' early students was Mary Whiton Calkin, who completed every course and requirements for earning a PhD, but was denied that degree by Harvard University because she was a woman. She was allowed to take those classes as a guest only. Calkins eventually established a psychological laboratory at Wellesley College. Her work was some of the earliest research in the area of human memory and the psychology of the self. In 1905, she became the first female president of the American Psychological Society. Unlike Washburn, Kathleen never earned the elusive PhD despite a successful career as a professor and researcher. This might be a good place to point out that women were not the only minorities to make contributions in the early days of psychology. In 1920, for example, Francis Sanner became the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology at Clark University. He eventually became the chair of the psychology department at Harvard University and is assumed by many to be the father of African American psychology. Kenneth and Mamie Clark worked to show the negative effects of school segregation on African American children. Hispanic psychologist George conducted research in the area of intelligence testing, focusing on the cultural biases in such tests. Since those early days, psychology has seen an increase in all minorities, although the percentages are still far too small when compared to the population at large. In the new field of psychology, functionalism offered an alternative viewpoint to the structuralist, but like so many of the psychology's early ideas, it is no longer a major perspective. Instead, one can find elements of functionalism in the modern field of educational psychology, studying the application of psychological concepts to education and industrial and organizational psychology, studying the application of psychological concepts to business, organizations, and industry, as well as other areas in psychology. Functionalism also played a part in the development of one of the more modern perspective, evolutionary psychology, discussed later in this topics.